the first appointment he had with race control was his car being incorrectly positioned on the starting grid. Now, from the onboard camera, you get a sort of sense of what the driver can see. And there's not very much you can see. Now, either side of the starting grid, you'll have these hatchings that sort of run across the front of the car like this. And the driver has to sit with their front wheels fully inside of it. You can see it here very neatly on the front of the Aston Martin. The car is fully inside its grid box. But from this onboard footage, it looks absolutely fine for the Alpine. Whereas actually, if you take another look at the starting grid, you can see what I'm talking about here. It's very subtle, but the FIA did pick up on this, and they have been hot on this before. Now, have a look at Esteban Ocon's car here. You can see just in front, you can see the little dots where you can see the ends of the grid hatching of each car, and you can see quite clearly Esteban Ocon's front tyre just sitting over that line, which is not where it should be. So you can see very clearly Ocon's front wing sticking out, and you can see sticking out. Now, last year, there was an incident at the Brazilian Grand Prix where Lewis Hamilton, and I think it may have been Esteban Ocon as well, was sitting out of their grid hatchings, and that wasn't penalised. Well, the reason I understand that that wasn't penalised last year was because the grid hatchings at Interlagos were painted ever so slightly too small, so those drivers got away with it. But here, the grid hatchings are painted absolutely perfectly. Well, the race got underway and Esteban Ocon picked up a 5-second penalty for being out of position at the start. But during that time, he took a bit of a biff from another car behind. I think it was the Haas of Kevin Magnussen, who did a bit of damage to the back end of the Alpine. Well, coming into the pits, there was some front wing damage on the Alpine as well. Coming to the pits to serve his mandatory penalty, the 5-second penalty. Now, the rules here are very, very strict. You come into the pits to serve any sort of penalty, time penalty. Your mechanics are not allowed to perform any work on the car whatsoever for 5 seconds with the car stationary. Any work that happened before that point, you're going to get another penalty. And that's exactly what seems to have happened here. Now, it happened very quickly at that moment. Just a couple of seconds, you saw the mechanics dive in, but you can see them dive in, but they hover around the car. Now, if you have a look around this corner, where you've got the mechanics getting their front wing adjustment tools out to change that nose structure on the front of the Alpine. Now, what happens is the mechanics are aware of this rule. So they just sort of hold back for a moment and don't get going on the car. And you can see them waiting, and then suddenly they get going. That's when they thought the 5-second penalty was served. However, the FIA, with some more detailed cameras, have studied this, and apparently one of the Alpine mechanics came into contact with the car with his tool 0.4 seconds too early, 0.4 of a second, and that resulted in another penalty being issued to Esteban Ocon. So he then got a 10-second penalty in place of the 5-second penalty because they didn't serve the 5-second penalty properly. The trouble didn't end there. Now, Esteban Ocon had to come back to the pits for another stop later on, and he got busted for pit lane speeding, and he was 0.1 kph over the pit lane speed limit. That resulted in another 5-second penalty, so Alpine eventually decided to serve both the 10-second penalty for not serving the 5-second penalty and the additional 5-second penalty together for a 15-second pit stop penalty. At which point, Alpine sort of did a few more laps, and I spoke to the team just after the race, and they sort of said, well, we retired the car to essentially to save the power unit, save any more damage, and I think with a little bit of gallows humour, they said, and save there being any more penalties.